When facing the end, it is time to come clean. At least that's what happened for numerous individuals who committed some pretty heinous and noteworthy acts. Admissions of murder, theft, and forging of famous photos are just some of the shocking deathbed confessions that have come down to us throughout history. It's hard to tell if any of these confessions are true, but several of them provided answers to seemingly unanswerable questions, offered resolutions to previously cold cases, or gave families much needed closure. These last words definitely left an impression. If you like true stories of the macabre, strange, and paranormal, then please click on that subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you can be notified every time a new episode of Grim Events is uploaded. Without further ado, let's talk about some deathbed confessions. Number 1. An outlaw biker admitted to slaying a teenager and feeding her body to alligators. When 17-year-old Amy Billing disappeared on March 4, 1974, the entire community of Coconut Grove, Florida was devastated. Amy reportedly made a trip home after getting out of school, changed clothes, and was seen getting into a van to visit her father's place of business. She never arrived. Investigators looked for Amy, but to no avail, and even used her journal as a guide to try to figure out what happened to the girl. Authorities found her camera by the highway, but there were no real leads as to the whereabouts. Amy's mother, Susan, never stopped looking for her daughter and traveled around the world following potential leads. She wrote a book about her investigation, detailing all of the tips called in and a motorcycle outlaw subculture that she was drawn into as she searched for her daughter. One of the strongest leads that Susan possessed was that Amy had been taken by members of the Pagans Motorcycle Club to a party in the Everglades. In 1998, a former enforcer for the Pagans, Paul Branch, confessed to the deed, admitting that the club had picked Amy up, slipped her something, and then taken her to their clubhouse and repeatedly assaulted her. Amy's heart stopped as a result of substance and abuse, and the gang dropped her body in the swamps of the Everglades to get rid of the evidence, feeding her to the alligators to cover their tracks. According to authorities, Branch and other members of the Pagans had been questioned in Amy's disappearance, but repeatedly denied any knowledge of the event. Only at the end did Branch admit to his wife that members of the club were responsible. It's unclear if Susan ever believed Branch's confession, or if any actual confession ever took place. Authorities were hesitant to believe Branch's widow, thinking that she was just trying to capitalize off the passing of Amy and her husband. Susan Billing continued to look for her daughter, indicating that she wasn't satisfied with the widow's information. The case remains unsolved to this day. Number 2. Margaret Gibson confessed to the slaying of director William Desmond Taylor. Margaret Gibson wasn't a prime suspect in the death of Hollywood director William Desmond Taylor, but in her final moments, she asked for a priest and confessed to the slaying. Gibson, a former actor, worked with Taylor in 1910, but after he passed, this connection didn't receive notice. There were several more likely suspects, including Taylor's friend and possible lover Mabel Normand, a young woman in love with Taylor named Mary Miles Minter, and Taylor's former valet, Edward Sands. William Desmond Taylor was slain in early February 1922. There were no witnesses, and Norman was the last person known to see him alive. Norman had a substance abuse habit, and there were theories that Taylor's attempt to clean her up may have been a motive. When police searched his house, they found love notes from Minter as well as a nightgown, and later discovered that she had once tried to end her life with a gun that resembled the one used on Taylor. The investigation into Taylor revealed that Sands had been stealing money from Taylor, and authorities discovered one additional suspect, Minter's mother, Charlotte Shelby. Shelby was said to be opposed to any relationship that may have been budding between her daughter and Taylor. There is no known motive for Gibson having slain Taylor, and the case remains unsolved. When Gibson confessed, she was going by the name Pat Lewis, and during her time in Hollywood, she'd been in trouble with the law. But aside from her confession, there is nothing linking her to the incident. Number 3. A woman told police her late husband confessed that he had stolen Marie Antoinette's pocket watch. In 2006, an anonymous woman hired a lawyer to negotiate selling some antique clocks and watches that her late husband had collected over the years. Some 40 timepieces were sold to the Le Maire Museum in Jerusalem, and when asked by investigators later, the woman stated that her husband confessed on his deathbed to stealing them from that same museum in 1983. The woman, Neely Shamrat, was the widow of Naaman Diller, an Israeli thief who was a repeat offender who specialized in forgery and break-ins. He could scale walls and slip through small windows. He was active in Tel Aviv during the 60s and 70s, during which time he met Shamrat. The two had a brief love affair, but she moved to the United States and married someone else. In the 80s, the two were reunited and were married in 2003, although Shamrat continued to live in the U.S. They met up regularly in Tel Aviv and in Europe. Accounts differ as to how, but before Diller's passing in 2004, the spoils of his thievery were collected into a box and moved to Europe before Shamrat took possession of them. One item was a watch made by Abraham Louis Breguet for Marie Antoinette. The watch took over 40 years to complete and wasn't finished until 1827, long after Marie Antoinette's time. In fact, even Breguet had passed away, and his son had took over the task of completing it. Breguet was known as the watchmaker of the kings, the king of the watchmakers, and his works combine invention, innovation, and luxury into one timepiece. The watch that he had constructed for Marie Antoinette was made out of gold and sapphires and valued at over $30 million when it was recovered. Diller had been questioned at the time of the robbery, but there was no evidence that he committed the act. Neely Shamrat was arrested for possession of stolen items, convicted, and sentenced to probation and community service. Number 4. Nessie was fate. Sightings of the Loch Ness Monster date all the way back to the 6th century, but the most famous photographic evidence of the creature's existence come from the 1930s. In 1933, several people claimed to see the Loch Ness Monster, which increased interest in the mystery as well as tourism to the area. The so-called surgeon's photo taken by Colonel Robert Wilson in 1934 captured the head of Nessie as the monster swam through the waters of the Loch Ness. Wilson, a British surgeon, claimed that he'd been diving near the loch and saw something swimming, at which point he stopped to take a picture. He never wanted credit for the image, hence it being called the surgeon's photo, and until the 1990s, it was believed by many that he'd captured actual proof of the monster's existence. This isn't to say that there were skeptics. In 1984, Stuart Campbell addressed the picture and decided that whatever was on the surface of the water couldn't be more than 2 or 3 feet and must have been some sort of explainable wildlife. Even Campbell was proven wrong, however, when Christian Sperling confessed at the end of his life that he had perpetrated the hoax and had been part of the fake photo's creation. A 90-year-old Sperling passed in 1994. According to Sperling, he was in cahoots with his stepfather and the Loch Ness Monster enthusiast Marmaduke Wetherall, as well as Wilson, when he sent a toy submarine with an animal head attached to the top out into the loch. The picture was staged by Sperling and Wetherall, who then handed it off to Wilson to give it credibility as he presented it to the public. Oh, you guys, that one to me is just heartbreaking. I love the Loch Ness Monster. Number 5. James Washington thought he was at the end and confessed to murder, but he survived. In 2009, Nashville prison inmate James Washington suffered a heart attack, or a seizure attack according to some outlets, an experience that prompted him to confess to the slaying of Joyce Goodner in 1995. Washington was in prison for second-degree murder conviction from 2006, thought that he was at the end of his life, either in an attempt to find absolution or as an act of pure desperation. Washington told a prison guard that he had ended Goodner, a woman that had been found brutally slain in Nashville, Tennessee 17 years earlier. Washington recovered from his ailment and tried to take back his confession, claiming he was hallucinating. He was put on trial, where it came out that Washington had been in a relationship with Goodner. After a 3-day trial, Washington was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 6. KKK member Henry Alexander denied involvement in Willie Edward Jr.'s slaying until his final moments. In 1957, 4 Ku Klux Klan members grabbed a truck driver, Willie Edwards Jr., and forced him to jump off the Tyler Goodwin Bridge near Montgomery, Alabama. Edwards, only 25 at the time, had stopped for something to drink on the way back from a delivery where he was forced out of his truck at gunpoint and into a car. The Ku Klux Klan members claimed Edward had offended a white woman and beat him as they drove to the bridge high above the Alabama River. Once they arrived at their destination, they made Edwards get out of the car and told him to jump or be shot. Edwards jumped 125 feet. He did not survive. One of the 4 men that took part, Raymond Britt, confessed to the crime in 1976. He was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony against the 3 in his company: Sonny Kyle Livingston, Henry Alexander, and James York. None of the men were ever convicted, however, and the charges against them were thrown out not once, but twice. Alexander, according to his widow, Diane, finally admitted to her that he'd been one of the men who forced Edwards to jump. According to Diane, her husband was not only played a part in the slaying, but was the one who falsely identified him as the man who offended a white woman, prompting the action against him. Alexander told his wife, "I didn't think he would jump. If he had run, they would have never shot him." Alexander was remorseful, and just before he died, he said, "I had no business hating the blacks. They've never done anything to me." Number 7. Otis Toole confessed to slaying a 6-year-old right before he passed. 6-year-old Adam Walsh vanished from a Sears department store on July 27, 1981. He was on a shopping trip with his mother, who let her son out of her sight for just a moment, never to see him again. The search for Walsh led to the discovery of the boy's head in a canal over 100 miles away from the Hollywood, Florida Mall, where he disappeared. His body was never discovered. Walsh's father, John Walsh, became an advocate for missing children as the host of America's Most Wanted, and never gave up when it came to finding the person responsible. There were several suspects, one of whom was Otis Toole. According to the Walshes, however, the investigation was botched. Toole had been partnered with another serial slayer named Henry Lee Lucas, and both men confessed to countless grisly acts over the years. Toole, in prison for another slaying soon after Adams, twice confessed, but recanted both times. Despite this, John Walsh always believed that Toole was responsible. It was only in his final moments that Toole told his niece that he had done it. Number 8. Woman confesses to providing her son with an alibi, but may have falsely accused him. In 2008, the Illinois State Police received an email from Janet Tessier telling them that her brother was responsible for the oldest cold case in the nation's history. Tessier had been at her mother's side 14 years earlier, just before she passed, when the older woman confessed to providing her son, John, with a false alibi for the slaying of 7-year-old Maria Ridolph in 1957. Maria Ridolph disappeared from Sycamore, Illinois in December 1957, and her body was discovered in Galena the following spring. The FBI didn't have any solid leads until an anonymous phone call brought them to the Tessier household. When authorities asked Ralph and Eileen Tessier where their son was on the night that she vanished, they claimed he was miles away at a military base. For the other Tessier children, Janet was only an infant at the time, but her older sisters remember the night vividly. This was problematic because they knew it wasn't true. According to Jean Tessier, I thought she must be protecting him because she had, to my knowledge, lied to protect him before. John was abusive to all of his family members and seemed to be unstable, but his mother covered for him that night. Eileen Tessier admitted to lying for her son shortly before her passing in 1994. By this time, John had changed his name to Jack McCullough and moved to Seattle, where he worked as, of all things, a police officer. After his arrest and trial, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison in 2012. But a collect call Tessier made around the supposed time of the event placed him in another town. In 2017, a judge ruled that Tessier was innocent. Number 9. A woman falsely accused a black friend of rape, which sent him to prison for over a decade. After Alice Mock accused Wayne Camille Jr. of rape in 1975, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the offense. According to Mock, Camille also robbed her, but on her deathbed, she admitted that she had invited Camille into her apartment and actually robbed him once he passed out from drinking. Before passing, Mock revealed the true story to her neighbor. Mock only made the claim because she didn't want her landlord to know that she had invited a black man into her apartment. She also didn't want Camille to know that she had taken money from him. After Mock's confession, Camille was released from prison in 1987. Number 10. Woman tells her family she slayed her husband and stored his body in a freezer. Geraldine Kelly told everyone that her husband John died in a traffic accident after returning to Massachusetts from California, where the rest of the family was living. But in 2004, she admitted that it had all been a lie. Kelly had shot her husband around 14 years earlier, storing his body in a freezer. Kelly, losing a fight with cancer at the age of 54, told her daughter what she had done and that the body was still in the same freezer. Kelly, who had also moved back from California, shipped her husband's remains to Massachusetts during the late 90s. When authorities visited Kelly's storage unit where the freezer was stashed, they found it unplugged, locked freezer, sealed with duct tape. The remains inside were ultimately determined to be John. Some believe Kelly was a victim of domestic violence, but motive for the incident remains unclear. Well, that was it, ladies and gentlemen. 10 deathbed confessions. So tell me, what are your thoughts? Do you believe some of these? Do you think some of these are made up? Leave your thoughts and comments below. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you have a great rest of your day.